Apologies in advance for the verbose story. I was brought up as a single child of a wealthy couple, spoiled rotten from day one, with no boundaries, no accountability, no responsibility. I got what I wanted, and the older I got, the more I wanted. My high school graduation gift was a condo on the beach in Maui, and I saw nothing wrong with that. Somewhere along the way, I learned that guys found me attractive, and I learned to add those weapons to the arsenal too. Enter my husband. He was probably the most unique guy I ever met. He didn't care what I had or who I knew. He was just happy to be with me. Where I was selfish beyond words, he was giving and selfless. Where I was a brat, he was kind and patient. He seemed like he had the ability to see right through me and touch my soul. And somehow, he wasn't scared off by the dark things he saw in there. So we got married and lived a fairly normal life. I had my usual mood swings, but I was generally pretty happy overall with him and with my life. I'd never met someone that could just be so in love with another person, and here he was. Even the sex was great, and he seemed to have an amazing intuition about whether I needed one of those rough and tumble quickies or the all-night slow and steady lovemaking. What more could I want? For about 8 years, nothing. I was busy doing this and that, but overall, I was more content than I thought I'd ever be. Somewhere along the line, I learned to be less of a spoiled brat, and I spent more time anticipating my hubby's needs and trying to make him happy. A big change from my usual take it or leave it attitude. My mom used to say, "Wow, look at the grown-up all of a sudden." Then it happened, and to this day, I have no idea why. We were out having dinner one night, and an older gentleman at another table caught my eye, and in the back of my head, I had really ugly thoughts, wondering what it would be like to let him seduce me. The whole night, I had all sorts of dirty little images in my head, even though I didn't even know the guy. Somehow, these thoughts just kept coming. Eventually, I got defiant. What? Was I supposed to never be attracted to another guy or have sex with anyone other than my hubby? Who says so? On one hand, I knew what I had with my hubby, and I never wanted to do anything to risk that. On the other hand, I was telling myself that I was either mentally ill or I was lying to myself and owed it to myself to try to find more. I never acted on any of these thoughts, but I was racked with guilt and feeling like an all-around terrible person for having these thoughts in the first place. At this point, it was all sort of vague and ethereal to me, but then something happened to change it. A cute guy started flirting with me, and I found myself flirting back. Now, it wasn't just some far-off dreamy fantasy. Now, there was something concrete to act on or pass by, and the thoughts in my head were on the verge of exploding. I did the stupidest thing you could ever imagine. I blurted it all out to my poor hubby. In a pile of blonde tears, I told him that I didn't want to hurt him, but I felt this attraction to other men, and I knew sooner or later I was likely to be unfaithful to him. As was typical for him, he handled it way better than I expected. Instead of calling me a slut and slapping me across the face, which is probably what I deserved, he just held me and told me that he knew I was struggling with something and that our love was so strong he had no doubts things would work things out. Of course, I love you and I don't want you to cheat on me, but I don't want to see you in pain or conflicted either. I mean, how many guys could be so understanding in a situation like that. Not much was said for a few days after that. The next move was his. "You know, I've been thinking about the chat we had the other day. I think maybe you're just fantasizing about the grass being greener elsewhere. Maybe it would do you good to get all dressed up and actually go on a date with some other guy. Maybe you just need to confront the reality instead of the thoughts in your head. Besides, if you dated some other guy before we met, it would mean nothing. So long as you don't fall in love and dump me for someone else, what's the harm?" I was totally in shock. Just like the jump from having impure thoughts to flirting with some guy seemed huge. This was a way bigger step, and now it was out in the open. He made it 100% my choice. It was a lot to think about. The childish version of me would have jumped at the chance, but the adult me sort of knew better. I knew I could deeply wound the person that meant more to me than anyone. And I knew that if I got a taste, I didn't trust myself to just say, "Phew, that's out of my system." Later, I wondered if the natural response would have been, "No, I don't want to do anything like that." And I wondered if my silence was telling to him. I spent the next few weeks mulling everything over in my head, and little by little, I talked myself into it. I figured that so long as I didn't lie to hubby and do all sorts of hurtful and destructive things behind his back, it would be okay. Besides, I could just give him the veto button and agree to stop at a moment's notice if he uttered even a single doubtful word. I was truly delusional now, so I told hubby I might be ready to take him up on his offer, mostly just as a way to see if it would make the thoughts in my head disappear. You know, like most guys are jerks, and maybe it would be therapeutic somehow to be reminded of that, and he'd end up with a happier, more dedicated wife afterwards. He didn't say a lot, but we had a conversation about some ground rules and stuff. He seemed mostly interested in whether I had a victim, that was his word, in mind yet. But I didn't have a clue. Weeks went by, and I was feeling a bit better since a lot of the guilt I had bottled up faded. It's horrible to go through something so complex and confusing without the help of your number one ally. And that's where I had been. I was coming to terms with it, I guess. I remember telling myself it was like getting that Amex Black card when I was 15. A cool and powerful thing to have in your purse, but you don't necessarily have to use it every day. During this time, I guess I tried to be the perfect wife. I didn't want hubby to feel like he was losing me, and I wanted to show him how much I loved and appreciated him. The sex was good, and I think maybe he stepped it up a notch, thinking he was in some sort of competition. Of course, the whole situation was in a pretty unstable place at that point, and soon enough, I stumbled across my victim. He was a little older than hubby, and super attractive, confident, and all that. I got the sense he was a lot more dominant than hubby, and he was accustomed to taking what he wanted, and that excited me. We met pretty randomly in a coffee shop. He flirted with me. I flirted back with him. We traded phone numbers. I spent a day thinking through it before answering his texts or telling hubby, but I guess I was feeling ready to take the next step. I knew once I told hubby it would be cemented, so I wanted to be sure this was something I was ready to pursue. Did a lot of soul searching, and I remember thinking, well, if not now, when? In bed that night, I told hubby I thought I might have found him. I guess I knew this day would come, In some ways, I'm happy for you, even if I'm a little sad for me. Just let me know what you're doing and if there's anything I need to worry about, and tell me if you need my help in any way." I remember crying myself to sleep that night, but the next day, it was different. My new BF was calling and texting, and it was nice to be feeling that new relationship energy. I told him I was married. He was too, and we agreed to meet for a quick coffee date the next morning. He was strong and firm, and in many ways, I felt tamed by him. We touched a few times, innocently, and he walked me to my car, where we parted with a pretty, sexy, deep kiss. If he pushed, I would have probably gone with him at that point, and we would have spent the next few hours in bed. But I resisted. I felt like I needed to ask permission before going that far. "So, how did it go?" And I proceeded to give hubby the details, though I noticed I was too ashamed to give him the real, intimate details. He got an accurate rendition, but one that was somehow scrubbed of the emotional stuff. I wanted him to tell himself, well, she was there, but it was no big deal, if that's what he wanted to do. His big focus seemed to be on whether I was going to see him again, and when. We had our second date a few days later. His wife was working late, and so we decided to have dinner. I told him it would be okay to pick me up at home. I'd watch for his car and come out when I saw him. I got my hair done, wore my favorite little black dress, and really tried to stun him. There was definitely a bond forming, and several times I found myself wondering what it would be like to be in bed with him. In the car on the way back, he rubbed my legs under my short dress, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. It was the same drill when I got home, except this time it was harder to keep the emotions from hubby's watchful eye. He saw that glow, and he's not a stupid man. This time his big question was, when are you going to start sleeping with him? Which caused me to burst out into tears. Mind you, I didn't deny it. Best I could offer was, I don't know yet. Soon enough, I did know. My BF's wife was going out of town on an overnight business trip, and we decided to get together. I think we felt a little weird to be in his house with his wife not there, so we agreed to meet in the city, where my dad still has a nice apartment I have the keys for. We got there around 7 o'clock, and by 7:15, our clothes were in a pile on the floor, and we were in each other's arms. I don't want to be too graphic, but while I couldn't tell you what specifically he did that was any different than hubby, somehow my body was off the charts taking it in. I've never had sex like that, and in the moment, it was sheer bliss, over and over again. When I got home the next day, hubby was putting on a good act, but I could tell he was upset. I mean, he knew what I did, so it wasn't an abstract thing anymore. He asked if it was all I hoped, and I just blushed and nodded. I told him I'd share whatever details he wanted, and we pretty much agreed not to go through the gory details. He actually had bought me a dozen roses that I found on our kitchen table, with a little "love you" note. I could see a tear in his eye, and all at once, I felt terrible in every dimension. For being a terrible wife to him, and for enjoying what I did so much. I wanted to tell myself, no, that's enough. But instead, I found myself thinking, maybe he'll handle it better next time. We kept away from each other for a few days physically after that night, and I don't think hubby knew what to do with me. I felt like the world's biggest slut, so I'm not sure I felt attractive to him anyway. He gave me a little space to think, And when we reconnected, it was a loving feeling that seemed to wash away my sins. So that was my life for over a year. On average, I'd spend a night or two having amazing sex with my boyfriend, then keeping my marriage patched together as best I could. I didn't want to, but little by little, I found myself de-emphasizing hubby in favor of my BF. If they both wanted to do something on a Friday night, I'd definitely be with my BF. The sex kept being amazing with my BF. Maybe mostly because it was so taboo, and it kept getting less and less frequent with hubby. I noticed I had a tendency to be cruel to hubby, as though somehow he was to blame for unleashing this whole thing. Once I told him I was thinking of being monogamous to my boyfriend, since it was confusing having ongoing sex with both of them. I hated myself for saying these things, but I couldn't help myself. I was returning to being the spoiled brat I was at 5 years old. Anyway, I guess I rambled on quite enough now. The only final part to share is how it all ended. My boyfriend and I decided we were going to take a little vacation together. I told him about my condo in Maui, and he really wanted to see it. He told his wife he was going on a business trip, and we spent a week screwing our brains out in Hawaii. When I got back, I could tell something bad was up. Hubby was gone. His clothes were there, but his car wasn't, and nobody seemed to know where he had gone. Couldn't get him on the phone or by text, and there was virtually no word where he might be. Part of me was applauding him. Good. You're finally going to dump me and give me what I deserve. But mostly, I was just concerned. He's the most verbal man I've ever known, and it would be totally out of character for him to go and not say something. Occurred to me that since we share credit cards and bank accounts, I might get a clue by looking at his online charge activity. Sure enough, there was a charge at a gas station a few 100 miles away, and another at a roadside diner near there. It was a spot I know well, not far from a mountaintop cabin we own. It was winter, but I figured I'd drive out there the next day and see what was going on. Part of me wondered if he had another woman with him somehow. Isn't it funny I'd feel jealous and angry? Well, next morning, I got in the car, all tanned and happily serviced. It was a long drive, but I had nowhere to be, and along the trip, I thought how well things had turned out, and what a wonderful man I had found that would care for me so much to let me do all the stuff I'd been doing. And that other wonderful man that knew how to make my body sing. I got up to our street. It's really a long, winding, tree-lined dirt road more than a street, and I was surprised to see police there with a barricade blocking the road. Ma'am, sorry, I can't let you go further. We found some poor fellow dead, and the detectives have to clear the scene in case there's been any foul play. Yes, it was my hubby, and yes, he was gone. Best we could piece together was that he managed to go outside when it was about 10 below, and somehow he locked himself out. It was ruled accidental, but I don't believe it. I think he just had enough. That night, he drank himself into oblivion, then sat on our little porch with the snow swirling around him, and he froze to death, just like his horrible wife made him feel irrelevant and froze him out of her heart. The night it happened, he ordered a dozen roses with a card addressed to me. The delivery guy found the body so that I didn't have to. Inside, he had set the table for dinner. There were 2 normal places set, with a third having the dish turned face down. On my nightstand, I found a greeting card addressed to me. It had a big red heart on the cover, and inside he had written, "You have always been the greatest love of my life. I hope you are happy in ways you never thought possible, and that this remains true today and always." The rest is just too painful to relate, so I'll end the story here with a few simple observations. 1. I loved that man so much more than my own limitations would allow me to understand or believe. 2. People can be so self-absorbed, arrogant, and narcissistic. They never see the world clearly or understand the immense damage they do. God grants their deepest wish, and they piss all over it. 3. If I could rewind the clock and pour battery acid on my face or shoot myself in the head instead of entertaining my depraved fantasies, I would gladly do so. Truly, I wish it were me, frozen to death on that porch, for I am the lowest form of dirt to exist on earth. Instead, one of God's truly precious creatures is gone from this earth, for the crime of wanting to see his wife happy. I'm sure he's at God's side in heaven, and while I pray every day for God's forgiveness, I suspect there is no redemption for me.